Now we have the last author in person, who is Sisanda Koala. He's a final year PhD candidate at the University of Cape Town, Center of Rhetoric Studies. Sorry. And the article, the presentation is called Language as Symbolic Action in Digital Mob Censorship, a Burkean analysis of tweets directed at South African female journalists reporting on high-profile cases. Please, Sisanda, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I must just correct that I have actually graduated now. So I'm doctor. I think the bio was old.
Outdated.
Yeah, thank you so much. Could you please bring up my presentation? Okay, so good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and good evening to those watching online, wherever you may be. I am the last person speaking on this academic conference, so I hope I end off with a bang. As the moderator said, my topic is on language as symbolic action in relation to online violence against journalists in the South African context. And as we've heard throughout this conference, online violence against journalists is a global phenomenon, and the studies that have been outlined have documented patterns suggesting that specific groups of journalists, particularly defined by gender, are likely targets of online harassment, which is intended to make women journalists in particular self-censor. So my study focuses on the use of language as symbolic action for mob censorship in digital spaces against female South African journalists. And the contribution to the broader discussion on online violence against women journalists that the study endeavors to make is really twofold. Firstly, it's one of the few studies, according to my surveying of the research landscape, that really gives an in-depth discussion on the issue from a South African perspective. As has been argued by the literature highlighted throughout the day, most of the current research really focuses on Western contexts. And there's minimal understanding on how the social dynamics in countries like South Africa, which firstly have a history of racial segregation and currently have a reality characterized by extremely high levels of violence against women, shape the online discourses used against women journalists whose profession really is about challenging the entrenched systems of power. And then secondly, the study aims to build on the prevailing approaches methodologically in terms of looking not at the self-reporting of women journalists on their experiences, but rather by undertaking an interpretive analysis of the content, in this case the tweets, that are directed at the journalists to really tease out the nuanced ways linguistic elements are used to mete out violence against them. So through the use of this notion of language as symbolic action, the study hopes to show that even when there isn't overt expressions of violence against women journalists, the use of devices, rhetorical devices like name-calling and chastisement is intended to perform the actions of belittling and admonishing these women journalists into silence. So just to give a bit of context, people who use Twitter will know that, you know, if you use direct hate on Twitter, you can be reported and that will result in your account being blocked. And also in South Africa, we've got a civil society-led initiative called the Real 411, where people who post violence or misinformation get reported by the public to this platform, and then the public, the platform then sort of regulates that. So when I explain the methodology, when I looked at the tweets, you won't see overt threats. I'm going to kill you, I'm going to rape you, that kind of content. It is more subtle. And I think the argument at the heart of my paper is that even these online, these subtle approaches such as belittling and chastisement need to be viewed as violence because they have that effect of keeping women journalists off the platform, or if they are on the platform, I'm steering them into certain kinds of discourses. So my key ideas are mob censorship, and we had the previous presenter really elaborate on this idea of mob violence and how it feeds into mob censorship. But in a nutshell, how I've defined, or how it's defined in my study, is violence exercised by ordinary citizens against journalists with the intention to intimidate and silence the press. And the key here is that it's ordinary citizens. It's not from political actors, whether in government or influential in society. It's normal people who are maybe doing it because they support a particular societal leader. So that is the one aspect. And then the notion of language as symbolic action, it was coined by the rhetorical theorist Kenneth Burke, who says that the view of language is as a species of action, symbolic action, and its nature is such that it can be used as a tool. So the language used in violent social media posts against women journalists, in terms of how I'm arguing in my paper, is not just to communicate about violence, but it is actually an act of meting out violence in and of itself. So with my study, it is a qualitative content analysis that employed rhetorical and thematic analysis to consider the tweets. I looked at 6 South African journalists' Twitter feeds, and I considered both what they tweeted as well as the replies or people who tweeted them. These journalists that I considered are really some of our top female journalists, ranging from political reporters, legal reporters, famed news anchors, and they were selected purposively because of the place they play in our in our media landscape. And the key question I sought to explore is what symbolic action is performed in the way language is used in violent tweets directed at selected South African women journalists. And I looked at a really mundane period. So not really, there wasn't any political activity, there wasn't anything really major. January, people are coming back from work. So it was to see on an ordinary month period, what kind of language is used when directing or speaking to these journalists, to get a sense, because obviously when there is a political issue, the discourse can be heightened because of that. But my interest is in the everyday conversations that are directed at women journalists, what kind of language is used. So there were 2 main approaches or linguistic devices that I found. The first was the use of the rhetorical device of belittling. And this approach was to belittle these women into silence through name calling. So most of the tweets that were coded as exhibiting violent language against women journalists employed name calling as a communicative strategy. And I forgot to mention in my analysis, I used Cresswell and Poth's approach to coding. So I started off looking generally at the feeds, and then I did just a first glance as to which tweets might seem to be violent, and then I did a more in-depth and iteratively, and I arrived at these particular communicative strategies. So in their book on propaganda, Alfred and Elizabeth Lee posit that as a rhetorical device, name calling is giving an idea a bad label to make us reject and condemn the idea without examining the evidence. So in this regard, there were 2 main ways in which name calling was used against these journalists. Firstly, these journalists were called names on the basis of their race, and secondly, it was also on the basis of their gender. And I think this is one of the reasons contexts like South Africa need to be studied in greater depth, because while in global contexts, we definitely see gender issues coming through in how journalists are harassed. In contexts like South Africa, where race really plays a role, it is a specific area that journalists are targeted. And not surprisingly, but it might be surprising to people who aren't from the country, but it's both black and white journalists. So it's not specifically targeting a particular racial category, but race is employed irrespective. So the one, and apologies for the poor qualities in the picture. So in the first tweet, which is on the left, it says of the journalist, "You drew fake graphs and got an award, Moloi wa Lekgowa." which this journalist basically did a story where she used graphics, and the person saying that she drew fake graphs, but then the word or the phrase that they use is basically translated into "you witch who is white," and that kind of language of and I go into it in the paper. I just have not really gone in depth in this presentation of describing women as witches and clamoring on the fact that this person is a white witch really evokes certain emotive responses in our context. And then on the right side, there is a tweet directed at a black journalist, and that one reads, let me just scroll to it. That one is about the woman being a house Negro, which basically describes black people who are said to assimilate or try and aspire to whiteness. So we see that race is really used against women journalists, whether they are black or white, using particular insults and belittling terms that have certain connotations in our context. And then the second linguistic device was trying to admonish these women into silence through chastising them. And here there were two main ways. It was through sexual innuendo and through mentalism. And I know other speakers have spoken around the sexual innuendo aspect, so I won't go into detail in that. But it in our context, which is already really one of the most violent countries against women, the use of these of sexual innuendos has just even greater meaning than in context where if you threaten a woman sexually, it is just a threat. In our context, it could actually have implications. And then, so in these two examples, through sexual innuendo, there's a tweet that says to the journalist, she needs to get laid to deal with her horny brain, which really aligns with a misogynistic view that wild women need to be tamed through sex, and that women who do not conform to the prevailing perspectives on femininity by challenging power, because she is a legal journalist, are deviant, she's a political journalist, are deviant and should be brought back in line by getting them a man. Then on the other hand, there's this approach where journalists, particularly female journalists, are called crazy, or their mental health challenges are made fun of in order to try and silence them. And the gendered nature of mental health is really documented as far back as the second millennium in BC, where women were prone to be diagnosed with hysteria, that it was really viewed to be their natural state. So in the same way as with the sexually depraved women, when a woman is described as crazy or having mental illness, such descriptions really are admonishments that are meant to silence her into obedience based on what is a patriarchal view of what is a good and noble woman, namely one who does not challenge power. So this woman, journalist, is someone who has shared publicly about mental health issues, trying to advocate for awareness. And in tweets like this, where they say, this one is skipping her brain medication and taking it for granted, basically the tweeter is using that against her to try and silence her. So in conclusion, when language is viewed as symbolic action as opposed to merely a communicative strategy or device, strategies such as belittling and chastisement are viewed as acts meant to perform certain functions. In the case of a public-facing platform like Twitter, these acts aren't just solely aimed at the journalist. They serve as a public performance of shaming and admonishment that undermines the women as people and professionals, particularly when the women are engaged in the journalistic tasks of holding powerful social actors to account. The people who are doing this aren't only discrediting these women primarily for who they are, but they then fuel hate towards them based on race and gender and discredit them by playing into well-entrenched stereotypes of sexually depraved and crazy women, people who should not be taken seriously. The power of the communicative strategies and linguistic devices described in the paper is vested in their appeal to certain norms and common sense logic deeply ingrained in sexist and racially stratified societies like South Africa, which are the way they are because of our past. The use of name-calling and chastisement in relation to women journalists finds resonance because the context such that online and offline women are regularly called names or admonished as they speak truth to power. And the purpose of using this notion of mob violence is that while the insults are directed at the women, as somebody tweets it, other people chime in and the conversation or the discourse grows. And in that way, then it's a mob that is trying to keep this woman journalist silent because she's daring to speak truth to power. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sisanda. We have 5 minutes left if somebody from the audience wants to make some questions. Yes, please. To give you the microphone for the recording. Yeah.
Muchas gracias. Good day. My name is Jamie Knight, and I work for the UNESCO Central American Office in Costa Rica. We cover Central America, and we have been putting a lot of emphasis on the mental health and resilience of female journalists. And I do hope that this topic is included in the revised UN Plan of Action, because I think there is a direct link between self-censorship and the psychological effects of these particular threats. A very interesting presentation. I wanted to know, in your interactions with female journalists in these countries, what did they tell you in terms of the extent to which these threats affected their mental health and how this affected their ability to be effective journalists? Thank you very much.
So my study did not involve any interviews with the journalists. However, I am a former journalist and obviously interact with my colleagues in that regard. And I think a previous presentation on this panel touched on it. What the main effect is that firstly, we see female journalists leaving newsrooms because of what this online harassment means. As I think two of the previous participants highlighted, there's really not that much support that they receive. And so in trying to cope, exiting the newsroom is a strategy. Secondly, they are a bit hesitant to engage on social media meaningfully, especially, and I think one of the participants made this point, especially when they are dealing with political or topics that are of a high profile nature that they know will direct attacks on them. So that means that, you know, they don't climb to the highest platform because they are holding back because of the repercussions which male colleagues may not face. So we're really seeing a chilling effect as the third consequence, in that other women journalists observe their counterparts being treated in this way, and even though the hate is not directed at them, it resonates and it creates conditions where the voices of women journalists are becoming more and more muted on certain issues as a response to the harassment and violence directed at them online.
Thank you very much. I don't know if the people that are online wants to answer these questions too about mental health in any way. If you want, just speak, please. Or if not, if there is some other question from the audience, or we just close. Okay, thank you very much. We close this panel and see you in the other activities of UNESCO.